Matt's heart dropped as he realized he had made the biggest mistake of his life. He knew he was in deep trouble when the owner of the facilities firm he worked for requested to see him immediately. With a heavy heart, he walked towards Dan Connor's office. His mind was racing. There was no way Dan could have found out about his embezzlement. As the only accountant and general manager, Matt was responsible for balancing all the company's accounts at the end of each month. As he knocked on Dan's door, Matt felt sick with anxiety. He tried to reassure himself that Dan never checked the detailed accounts unless there was a major discrepancy in the balance sheets. After all, Dan was more concerned about his expensive suits, fast cars, and chasing women. But as soon as Matt entered, he knew his illusion of safety was shattered. "So I guess the question I need to ask is, how long have you been stealing from me?" Matt's head spun with panic. "What? I have no idea what you're talking about." He continued to deny any wrongdoing until Dan produced transaction logs showing a significant amount of money had been transferred to one of Matt's personal accounts before being paid back to the company. He knew there was no escape now. He had been caught red-handed. "I'm really sorry, Dan. I just needed a short-term loan until the bridging company came through. Otherwise, we would have lost the new house that Susan had her heart set on. I didn't steal it. I paid it back as soon as I could, and before the end of the month." "I don't know what they'll charge you with, Matt. Theft or fraud. Maybe you could even be facing jail time. And even if you do manage to avoid that, you're most likely going to lose your job. I can't trust someone who has done something like this. Please give me another chance." It was a moment of weakness. "I've been working for the company for almost 20 years, and I've never even thought about doing something like this before. And I promise I won't do it again." Dan stood up from his chair and walked over to the window, deep in thought. "You and Susan have been my friends for a long time. That makes this all the more disappointing. Did Susan know about this?" Matt was taken aback by the question. He thought back. It was actually Susan's idea. She was so desperate to not lose the house that she suggested it, convincing Matt that no one would ever find out. Matt hoped involving Susan would make Dan less likely to report it to the police, but he didn't want to implicate her. After a long pause, he finally answered, no, she didn't know. Matt's response to Dan's surprise seemed to take him back, but he quickly brushed it off. He needed time to think about the situation and make a decision. Dan instructed him to go home and not come back until Friday, when a decision would be made. As Matt drove home, he couldn't shake the thought of how Dan had found out. No one ever looked at the transactions, and Dan certainly didn't pay attention to details. His biggest concern was which option Dan would ultimately choose for his punishment. None of them were desirable, but the idea of a court case and potential prison time left him in a state of panic. He knew Susan wouldn't be expecting him. He regretted buying their new home as he approached it. The thought of coming home early and finding his wife in bed with someone else crossed his mind, adding to his already disastrous day. Thankfully, Susan greeted him with her usual bright smile and fully clothed form as he entered the kitchen. He took a moment to admire her beauty, despite being just shy of her 40th birthday. Her long, curly brown hair was pinned up, with her bangs resting over deep brown eyes. He appreciated her figure now more than ever, with its curves and ample cleavage compared to when they first got married. But all of that would soon change, as he was about to shatter her sunny disposition for the foreseeable future. As Matt relayed the details of his conversation with Dan and presented the incriminating evidence, Susan visibly panicked. "It's all my fault. I'm so sorry," she said, wringing her hands. Matt reassured her, "I told Dan that you had no idea. There's no point in both of us getting in trouble." Susan suggested pleading with Dan, but Matt advised against it. They would just have to wait and see what Dan decided. It was going to be a long 3 days. Finally, Dan texted to say he would come by their house at 7 p.m. on Friday. Both Matt and Susan were consumed with nervousness. Dan arrived promptly in his Aston Martin, causing Matt to think bitterly about how he seemed to have everything: looks, money, charm, and now the power to destroy him. After exchanging strained greetings, and Susan offering him a beer as usual, Matt couldn't hold back any longer and dove into the conversation. The words tumbled out of Matt's mouth, thick with sorrow and regret. He could feel the weight of his actions bearing down on him as he looked at Dan, his best friend and business partner. A deep sense of shame filled him as he realized how much he had let everyone down. Dan's face was unreadable, but a strange smile flickered across his lips. "I do hope that is true, Matt." An unbearable silence followed, stretching on for what felt like hours until Dan finally spoke again. "You know, I've always been a little envious of your relationship with Susan, Matt. I miss having that sort of closeness in my life." Matt was taken aback by this admission. He had always assumed Dan to be a ladies' man, with an endless line of hot girlfriends. Maybe as he approached 30, Dan was starting to think about settling down. "So it's with that in mind that I have a proposal," Dan continued. "Neither of you will like it, but it may be the only way to avoid prison for you, Matt. And remember, there is a risk for Susan too, as the account and house are in both of your names. I know you wouldn't have done this without her approval." Matt's chest tightened and his breathing quickened as he considered the dire consequences of Susan being held accountable. He couldn't even fathom what kind of proposal Dan could possibly have in mind. Dan released a slow, drawn-out breath before speaking. "There's no easy way to say this, but my proposal involves me spending time with Susan." The room fell into stunned silence. Dan continued, undeterred. "No police involvement, no court cases or prison sentences for any of us. You both keep your jobs and relationship intact, but I get to spend every Friday night with her." Matt's voice barely above a whisper, he exclaimed, "You can't be serious." But Dan was deadly serious. "I've desired Susan for years, and this is an opportunity I simply can't resist." Susan pleaded for another option. "We can pay back more money, anything but this." But Dan cut her off. "This is my only offer. And let's be honest, I'm not exactly hard on the eyes. Maybe once things settle down, this arrangement won't be too uncomfortable for any of us." Susan begged for time to consider it, but Matt's head was spinning with anger. "You can't seriously be considering this, babe? Are you crazy?" "Desperate for any other solution," Susan responded. "We've been trying to think of alternatives all week." Matt seethed as he glared at Dan. "You're a despicable low-life scum. It's a sickening idea." But Dan just smiled in return. "That may be true, Matt, but I'm not a thief like you are." He then turned to Susan. "If we're going to do this, we need to start now. No more time for you to try and find a way out of it." After 15 minutes of shouting and accusations, Dan finally stood up and announced, "It's decision time. Either I walk out to my car or upstairs with Susan." He held out his hand towards her. With a moment of hesitation, Susan took it and led Dan through the living room and up the stairs. Matt was left sitting in shock, his body collapsing back onto the chair. Susan looked back at him as she climbed the steps. "There is no alternative, Matt. It'll be okay." But Matt couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal as he watched them disappear into the upper level of the house. Time seemed to stand still for Matt as he sat in the living room, his mind reeling from the shocking conversation that had just taken place. The room was silent, except for sound of his own ragged breaths. His thoughts immediately turned to what was happening upstairs, where he could faintly hear movement and a muffled conversation. Then, the unmistakable sound of someone sitting on the bed. Minutes passed like hours as Matt strained to make out the noises coming from above. He heard the first creak of the bed frame, followed by whispered words, and then a surge of passion as two people began to have sex. The sounds grew louder and more urgent, with repeated squeaks of the bed and muffled groans filling the air. Matt felt like he was losing his mind as he listened to this intimate moment between his best friend and his girlfriend. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, there was a loud exclamation of pleasure and a satisfied moan. Matt's heart sank with shame and guilt as he dried his tears and composed himself, expecting Dan and Susan to come downstairs at any moment. But instead, there was only more muffled conversation and movement from upstairs. As the minutes ticked by in silence, Matt couldn't help but think about Susan and whether she was okay. Just when he thought he couldn't take it anymore, he heard something again, the faint sound of the bed squeaking once more. He crept to the foot of the stairs and strained to hear more, catching snippets of Dan's voice. "That's it, baby. You're doing the riding this time. Those birds are fucking awesome. Stick them in my face." But what was most unsettling were the constant whimpers coming from Susan, mixed with occasional yes and Matt stood frozen in disbelief, unable to tear himself away from this private moment between two people he cared about. The walls of the house seemed to close in on Matt, suffocating him with their silent judgment. He couldn't take it anymore. He had to get out. Without a second thought, he rushed out the front door and began walking aimlessly down the street. As he walked, his thoughts were consumed by the image of Susan in bed with Dan. Was she enjoying it, or was she just putting on a show for him? The thought made his stomach churn. He couldn't help but wonder how vigorously she had argued against the idea, knowing that Dan was 10 years younger and undeniably handsome. Here he was, walking alone while his wife was with another man. By the time he reached the park, his thoughts had shifted. He realized that Susan was doing this to keep him out of jail, and he needed to get back to the house to make sure she was okay. As he approached the house, he saw that the Aston Martin was still parked outside. His heart sank as he entered the quiet house. Making his way to the kitchen, he grabbed a cold beer from the fridge and turned to see Susan standing behind him in a short robe. They both looked at each other in awkward silence before Matt managed to speak. "Are you okay?" he asked, trying to sound calm. Susan gave a small smile and nodded. "I am. Thanks for checking on me," she replied before explaining. "He's being decent, nothing rough or weird, just regular sex." Matt couldn't believe what he was hearing. "I'm sorry if you could hear things," Susan added apologetically. Matt shrugged, trying to brush off her words. At least it's over. But Susan's next words caught him off guard. Actually, he wants to go again, she said with a sigh. "He was thirsty, so I came for a beer and wanted to check on you." "Jesus," Matt muttered under his breath, feeling sick to his stomach. "He must have been saving this up for you." For a moment, they both stood there in awkward silence before Susan spoke up again. "Why don't you go into the den? It might be easier for you." Matt had been holed up in the den for what felt like an eternity, trying to come up with a solution to their current predicament. The weight of responsibility and frustration pressed down on him as he heard footsteps making their way down the stairs toward the hall. With a heavy heart, he went out to greet Dan, who was stifling a smile before breaking the awkward silence. "Listen, I know this isn't easy for you, Matt," Dan began, his voice sincere. "I promised to treat Susan with complete respect, and I really can't thank you enough for allowing me to spend time with her. I hope this gets easier for you, and obviously the work issues will remain between us." Raging inside, Matt wanted to tell Dan that they had no choice in the matter, but instead All he could muster was a curt response. "Don't thank me. You gave us no choice at all." Dan and Susan both looked uncomfortable, sensing the tension in the air. It was clear that it was time for Dan to leave. To Matt's amazement, as Dan said his goodbyes, Susan leaned in and kissed him. It wasn't a passionate kiss by any means, but it was on the lips and lingered for a moment longer than necessary. Before Matt could say anything, Dan had already left. He turned to look at Susan, bewildered and speechless. Confusion and anger filled the air as Susan's mistake was revealed. "What the fuck was that?" Matt's voice rose in disbelief. Susan could feel her heart drop. What? Oh, it was just a kiss goodbye. No, it wasn't. It was a sign of affection. "I guess you had a nice time after all, and I shouldn't have been so worried." Matt's tone was laced with bitterness. Susan's cheeks burned with frustration. "I can't believe your boss just fucked me 3 times, due to your actions, I might add, and you're bothered about a goodbye kiss." Matt's jaw clenched. "It's supposed to be a transaction. An arrangement, just sex. Were you kissing him upstairs?" "Some, I guess. Not a lot," Susan replied sheepishly. "Great. First of all, it's multiple times. Then I hear you enjoying it, and now it's affection." Matt's voice rose with each word. "It's not like that," Susan raged in response. "Everything I am doing is to keep us out of jail. I'm going to have to show willingness and make sure he enjoys it. Plus, I can't moan if he's busy doing that to me. It's not exactly a voluntary reaction I can control. We're both going to have to get used to this. If I can put myself through this, then you need to find a way to cope with it." The last comment drained the energy out of Matt. Despite his doubts about her actions, Susan was making the sacrifice, not him. She could walk away at any point and leave him in jail. Unable to face the master bedroom after what had happened there, they slept in the guest room for the night. Susan fell asleep quickly from exhaustion, while Matt stayed awake, his mind consumed with thoughts of how to escape this hellish situation. Their conversations over the following week were few and far between, and always centered around finding a way out of their predicament. Matt came up with various plots, but all seemed to be useless, as Dan always seemed to preempt them. One idea involved destroying all the evidence, but they soon discovered that Dan had removed Matt's access to the backups and had secured all financial data in a new cloud system. As the next Friday approached, Dan texted Susan to let her know he planned on taking her out for a meal, under the guise of making things easier for her. Matt wasn't sure if this was a better option. It felt too much like a date rather than a business transaction, yet it also meant less time in bed with Susan. As it turned out, he got the worst of both options. Susan seemed subdued about the idea of a date, but still got dressed up for it. Matt couldn't help but feel a twinge of jealousy as he watched her being assisted into Dan's Aston Martin, wearing a little black dress and slingback heels. The evening that followed only made him feel worse. He sent multiple texts to Susan throughout the night, asking if she was okay, but her replies were short and dismissive, stating that she was just having dinner or drinks. They finally returned home at 10 p.m., with Dan's arm wrapped around Susan's waist as they laughed and joked together. Matt glared at them. Once again, it seemed like Susan was having too good of a time and appeared slightly drunk. "This wasn't part of our agreement," Dan replied, flashing a charming smile at his friend. "Relax, Matt. It was just dinner and drinks between friends. If this is going to be awkward, maybe we'd better go straight on up." Matt's expression turned sour as he seethed with anger. "What do you mean straight up?" But Dan's smile never faltered as he said, "The deal was every Friday, Matt. So I'll be sleeping with Susan tonight. I'm sure you can manage in the spare room." Even through her drunken haze, Susan sensed the tension between the two men. Fearing that Matt might attack Dan, she quickly guided him into the kitchen, whispering soothing words in his ear. "It will be okay, hon," she whispered. "I'll quickly sort him out, and then pretend to go to sleep drunk. Remember, we don't have any choices." Matt begrudgingly retreated to the den, feeling powerless and angry. He could hear Dan and Susan going upstairs, Susan's giggles ringing in his ears. He hoped it was all an act for Dan's benefit, but a small part of him wondered if it was meant for him. Exhausted and frustrated, Matt finally fell asleep in the spare room. But every time he woke throughout the night, he could hear the bed squeaking down the hall as Dan and Susan carried on their affair. In the morning, when he went downstairs, he found Dan already sitting at the table while Susan cooked breakfast. His patience reached its limit. "Fuck off, Dan," Matt spat out. "It's not Friday, and your time is up," Susan tried to intervene, saying they should all try to be civil. But Matt had had enough. "You've got 10 seconds to get the fuck out of my house," he growled at Dan. Dan looked like he wanted to argue, but ultimately left without another word. As he walked out the door, he couldn't resist one last jab at Matt's vulnerability. "Don't forget what you have riding on this, Matt." Turning to Susan, Matt's anger only grew, making him breakfast. "Really?" he scoffed. "Why don't you just move him in? You're more of his wife than mine now." With that, he stormed out before she could even think of a response. For the third Friday in a row, Dan suggested they spend the night at a hotel to avoid any further confrontations with Matt. Susan left around 6 p.m., dressed casually so as not to upset her husband. The plan was for Dan to meet her in the hotel restaurant after she changed into something more fitting for their romantic evening. But Susan was taken aback by the opulence of the hotel when she arrived. Her casual clothing felt out of place amongst the grandeur. She collected the key to their pre-booked room and was surprised to find it was a luxurious suite. There were flowers on the side table and 2 gift-wrapped boxes on the bed. Opening the larger box, she found a stunning silver satin dress with a halter neck and thigh-high slit. The second box contained a red satin basque, matching thong, and luxurious black-seamed stockings. Susan hesitated, her hand hovering over the elegant dresses laid out before her. With a feeling of curiosity and excitement, she decided to try them on. To her amazement, they all fit her perfectly, hugging her curves in just the right places. She couldn't help but feel a surge of confidence and self-assurance as she admired herself in the mirror. Without a second thought, she made the decision to keep them on and headed down to the restaurant. As Dan caught sight of Susan, his jaw practically dropped to the floor. She looked absolutely stunning in those dresses, and he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride and satisfaction at how good she looked by his side. The dinner that followed was nothing short of exquisite, with wine flowing freely and a charged atmosphere between them, both knowing what was to come later. As the night went on, Susan found herself becoming more relaxed in Dan's company, no longer fighting against their arrangement, but embracing it fully. And when they finally returned to their suite, the way Dan slowly undressed her was nothing short of sensuous. She reveled in his reactions to her lingerie, the way the basque accentuated her curves and the stockings felt like pure luxury against her skin. Dan proved to be an attentive and skilled lover, leaving Susan feeling fulfilled in ways she never imagined possible. But as the morning light crept through the curtains after yet another round of passionate sex, Susan slipped into her casual clothes with a heavy heart. She knew she couldn't risk taking any of these items home with her. It was too risky for Matt to discover their secret. So they came to an agreement that Dan would keep everything at his house for future use. But as Susan lay awake next to Dan, her emotions were in turmoil. Guilt gnawed at her conscience, but she couldn't deny the exhilarating rush she felt from this forbidden affair. Meanwhile, Matt couldn't shake the nagging feeling of unease that had settled in his gut. As Saturday morning came and went without a word from Susan, he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of distrust towards her. He knew Dan was likely taking advantage of her again, and deep down, he doubted if she even tried to resist. It pained him to think that their marriage was on the brink of collapse because of this arrangement. For Susan, the guilt only seemed to intensify with each passing day. She knew that kissing Dan at breakfast that one time was a terrible mistake, and she was starting to question whether this whole arrangement was worth it. Despite her material desires being fulfilled by Dan's wealth and extravagance, she couldn't deny the intense physical connection they shared. And while she hoped Matt would eventually come around and accept their arrangement, she couldn't ignore the fact that their relationship had become distant and strained. She missed the steady presence he once provided in her life, but it seemed like a distant memory now. She tried to reassure him that she was handling things well and he shouldn't feel guilty, but her words fell on deaf ears. In her heart, she still loved Matt deeply and regretted the position they were now in. On a dreary Monday morning, Dan approached Matt at work and informed him that he would need to cover an out-of-town training event on Wednesday and Thursday of that week. Matt's suspicions were immediately aroused, but he knew he had no choice but to agree. His job was too precarious to risk refusing. As he begrudgingly agreed to the task, he made it clear to Dan that their personal arrangement could not be impacted by this trip. Dan reassured him, of course not. That night, when Matt told Susan about the trip, she didn't seem surprised or concerned. Training events were rare, but they did happen once or twice a year, so it didn't seem out of the ordinary. However, something about the timing felt too convenient for Matt. He went to the den, intending to plan a way out of the predicament, but his thoughts were interrupted by a blinding headache. As he ascended back up the stairs in search of painkillers, he overheard Susan speaking on the phone. Curiosity getting the better of him, he listened to her side of the conversation. "Why did you send Matt on this trip?" "No, it's a bad idea. This isn't working out, and you coming over will only make things worse." "No, he hasn't come up with any other solutions yet. It seems like he's given up and accepted his fate. This wasn't how I envisioned things going. He's devastated. You know, I enjoy our time together as well. I know I suggested this arrangement, but I never imagined it would affect Matt this much. It was supposed to be a safe alternative for us without any risk of being caught. But now everything is falling apart. I might have made things worse with my actions, kissing you and making breakfast for you. And let's not forget how you've been acting all high and mighty towards Matt. Fine, you can come over during the trip, but then I think we need to scale things back and be more discreet, or maybe even end it. If you're suggesting an end to our arrangement because of how it's affecting Matt, then you can be the good guy and we can go back to normal. Maybe if we're discreet, we could still meet up occasionally. We'll talk more later, but I really need to repair things with Matt. I still love him." Feeling like he had been punched in the gut, Matt stumbled down the stairs. Did he really just hear all of that? He couldn't fully comprehend the implications of what he had just heard. Susan had been the one to suggest it all. Dan couldn't deny as much as she tried to convince him otherwise. She had planted the idea and pressured Matt into borrowing the money against his better judgment, and now everything was falling apart. It was clear that Dan had orchestrated the whole thing, burying the discrepancy so deep that even an audit couldn't uncover it. He wasn't a saint protecting Matt from prison. He was a conniving cheat. The thoughts of revenge and violence swirled in Matt's mind as he struggled to calm down and think rationally. He needed a plan, one that would make them feel his own unease. Matt avoided Susan for the rest of the night, and the following morning, unable to face her after overhearing her phone call with Dan. But on Tuesday night, he saw her again and never mentioned what he heard. Instead, he told her about how he overheard Dan at work boasting about sleeping with some woman. Matt worried that Susan may have been mentioned by name. The next day, he left early for his trip, but not before Susan professed her love for him. He managed a brief smile before pretending to be distracted by checking his schedule on his phone. Later that morning, Dan arrived at Susan's house and she immediately asked about the boasting. But Dan denied any knowledge of it, accusing Matt of stirring things up. Confused and unsure who to believe, Susan discussed the situation with Dan in between bouts of sex. She couldn't help but feel that something was missing from their relationship, an emotional connection like she had with Matt instead of just physical pleasure. Before leaving on Thursday afternoon, Dan convinced Susan to continue their affair, but she made it clear that this would be their last time together until they sorted things out with Matt. As Dan left the house, he stopped short when he saw it. A large kitchen knife stood upright in the gleaming hood of his Aston Martin. All 4 tires had also been slashed. He frantically looked around but saw no one. He went back inside and told Susan, both of them panicking at the thought that Matt may have found out about their affair and sought revenge on Dan's prized possession. But it could also be kids, or someone jealous of the flashy car. It wasn't the first time it had been vandalized. Susan called Matt, pretending to ask about his course, and he casually confirmed that it was dull and unnecessary for him to be there. He never mentioned Dan or seemed upset. Susan relayed this information to Dan, hoping that maybe it was just some kids after all. They quickly arranged to have the car towed before Matt returned, adding more stress and expenses to their already messy situation. The tension in the air was palpable as Matt returned home on Thursday night. Susan tiptoed around him, playing the role of a dutiful wife, but inside she was anything but calm. She couldn't shake off the feeling that something was about to happen. On Friday morning, Matt left for work as usual, while Susan anxiously waited for Dan's message, confirming their meeting later that night. She couldn't help but hope that he would finally call a stop to their affair. Perhaps the accident with the car had been enough to make him come to his senses. But at 11 a.m., everything changed. Matt called Susan in a panicked and distressed voice from work, telling her that there was something she needed to see. He explained that he had received a video clip via their personal email and urged her to watch it. With shaking hands, Susan opened their email on her phone and found the message containing the video clip. The quality was poor and only lasted 20 seconds, but there was no mistaking what it showed. Susan and Dan engaged in a passionate act of lovemaking. The sender was an anonymous address. Matt's shocked voice broke through her thoughts. "Is that our bedroom? It's hard to tell, but it looks sunny, like midday. When could this have been taken?" Susan's mind flashed back to Wednesday afternoon. She could vividly recall Dan's powerful thrusts while they were in this exact position. But she quickly composed herself and replied calmly, "I'm not sure. Maybe it's edited, or the lighting is off." Matt didn't seem convinced. "That is you, isn't it? You seem to be enjoying yourself." Susan bit back her immediate response and instead focused on the situation at hand. She didn't have time for explanations right now. She needed to figure out how this video had ended up in Matt's possession. "What is Don playing at? Is this his way of torturing us? Did you have a falling out or threaten him?" Susan immediately denied any involvement, but then remembered her conversation with Dan about ending things. Maybe he had reacted badly and decided to use the video as leverage to keep their affair going. She couldn't believe that he would stoop so low. Matt revealed that Dan wasn't at work, so he couldn't ask him directly. Susan desperately wanted to reach out to Dan and try to mitigate the damage, but she knew it was best to wait until Matt wasn't around. Just then, her phone pinged with an urgent message from her sister Diane. She quickly ended the call with Matt and dialed Diane's number, hoping for some much-needed support and advice. But instead, she was met with a barrage of questions and expletives from her sister. After finally managing to get a word in, Susan discovered that Diane had also received the same video clip. As her phone continued to ring with calls and messages from her close friends and even her mother, Susan realized that this was not just a private matter between her, Matt, and Dan. The entire world seemed to know about their affair. Furious and overwhelmed, Susan tried calling Dan multiple times but couldn't get through. It was clear that he was avoiding her. As panic set in, Susan couldn't help but wonder if anyone else had also received the damning video. This was an absolute disaster, and there was no doubt in her mind that Dan was behind it all. The reason for her inability to contact Dan became clear as Matt nonchalantly picked up his work phone during a conference meeting. Without hesitation, he ripped out the battery and discarded it in the trash, keeping the handset and SIM card for himself. Before leaving work, he made a quick stop at Dan's desk and slipped an envelope onto it, containing crucial evidence of their illicit affair. As he arrived home, Matt relished in the sight of his wife's panic and confusion. She was devastated that her mother had likely seen the video and that all of their family and friends would think she was unfaithful. Matt played along, offering useless suggestions on how to contain the damage and feigning his own perplexity over when the clip could have been recorded. Susan still refused to confess to Dan's midweek visits. In the midst of the chaos, Susan couldn't help but wonder how everything had gone so terribly wrong. She had never intended to engage in an affair until one drunken night at a party when she flirted a bit too much with Dan. He was undeniably attractive and charming, and she found herself thinking about him often after that night. Over time, she convinced herself that she deserved some excitement in her life, even if it meant risking her marriage to Matt. She had seen a friend's marriage crumble after a similar affair came to light, but she thought she was smarter than that. It was all just harmless fun, right? But as she delved deeper into this secret arrangement with Dan, she failed to fully consider the implications it would have on Matt. The thrill and excitement soon turned into guilt and regret as she realized the true impact of her actions on her husband. A deep sense of pain and dread washed over her as she realized the enormity of her actions. Everyone in their friend group loved Matt, and now they would all know that she had betrayed him. She couldn't bear the thought of trying to explain herself, knowing that no one would believe her and that Matt would be devastated. The screech of Dan's car tires echoed through the quiet neighborhood as he arrived at Matt and Susan's home. Susan flew out the door, her rage barely contained as she launched herself at Dan. Matt stood by, watching with a blank expression on his face, a long scratch mark visible across his cheek. Despite Susan's best efforts, Dan managed to pin her against the wall long enough to speak. He had heard about the scandalous videos circulating among their friend group, but he vehemently denied having anything to do with it. Susan seethed with anger and confusion. If it wasn't you, then who? Matt suddenly burst into laughter. Both Susan and Dan were dumbfounded until Dan caught on first. Wait, you knew about us meeting this week? Matt nodded with a mischievous glint in his eye. Unfortunately for you both, I did. Susan tried to justify their affair as an extension of their arrangement, but it was clear that Matt had already made up his mind about their betrayal. Dan's mind raced as he watched the video, fully comprehending the gravity of the situation. He knew they had discussed the plan before, and suspected Matt had recorded it all. Desperately trying to salvage the situation, Dan spoke up. I'm deeply sorry, Matt. I couldn't resist Susan's temptations. I never intended for this to cause you so much pain. It was a lapse in judgment on my part, and I will end the arrangement and take responsibility for any financial irregularities." Matt responded with forced civility. "That's very noble of you, but it's too late. My resignation is already on your desk." Panic set in for Susan as she interjected. "You can't, Matt. How will we afford our house?" Matt's reply was calm but resolute. "Don't worry about that, dear. It's going up for sale tomorrow." "Trying to salvage any hope," Dan pleaded. "There's no need for this, Matt. We can move past this, and I truly value your expertise at the firm. You know the business inside out." But Matt's smile revealed his true intentions. "I suppose that's true. In fact, your main competitor has already offered me a job, and I believe some of our clients may follow me as well. As for you, Dan, you still owe me more than 4 weeks' notice as per our agreement." Dan's fake smile faded as Matt continued to deliver the final blow. "I suspect many of our employees may also choose to leave once they learn of your fraudulent actions and lack of leadership skills." Desperate to regain control of the situation, Dan tried to reason with Matt. "You have to think this through. You could still go to prison." But Matt simply shook his head and responded confidently. "Oh, I don't think so. Do you really want to implicate your lover? After all, she also benefited from the fraud. And thanks to your little rendezvous here, I have a video of you admitting to blackmail." It's incredible what kind of electronic devices are available these days. "The recording is in the hands of my lawyer as we speak, and let's not forget the conveniently deleted files on your computer. My trustworthy colleagues helped me out with that." Dan sneered. "That recording won't hold up in court." But Matt replied coolly, "Funny enough, my lawyer said the same thing, but I can use it in other ways, and by the time this all gets sorted out, you will be out of business. On the bright side, my new firm may be interested in buying you out. Rumor has it their new chief operating officer is a stand-up guy." Suddenly realizing the dire consequences for Dan and his company, Susan made a calculated decision to place all the blame on him. She turned to Matt with pleading eyes and began her performance as a wronged woman. "I love you, Matt. This was all Dan's idea. He forced me into it. I was just trying to protect you from going to prison, and now my life is ruined. Please, Matt, I love you." Dan's rage was palpable as he spat out the words, "You two-faced, lying fucking bitch." Matt couldn't help but smirk at the rather fitting description. "My dear loving wife," Matt began, his voice dripping with disdain. "In addition to the video evidence, you're overlooking the fact that I overheard you on the phone. Admitting this was all your idea. A rather elaborate and cruel cover-up for your affair." He leaned in closer to Susan, relishing in her discomfort. "You will find divorce papers in the envelope in the kitchen drawer. You're leaving tonight and will agree to the terms of the divorce, or more of those incriminating video clips might find their way to family and friends. I'm sure your mother will love to hear that not only are you a cheating slut, but also how extensively you plotted and blackmailed." Tears streamed down Susan's face as she slumped to the floor in defeat. Matt turned to Dan with a sly smile. "Do you want to take her with you?" "Not a fucking chance," Dan scoffed. "She's more trouble than she's worth." "Well, on that we are agreed," Matt replied smugly. Dan warned, "This isn't over, Matt." "True," Matt responded coolly. Without warning, Matt swung his fist towards Dan, catching him square on the jaw and sending him crashing to the ground. "It is now," Matt declared triumphantly. For weeks after their separation, Matt would listen repeatedly to the recording of their confrontation. While most of it was painful to hear, he couldn't help but smile at the part where Dan and Susan had been worried about Matt finding out and potentially going insane. The knife in the bonnet had been a nice touch of melodrama, and doing it brought him his first moment of joy in weeks. Matt took a new job with Dan's rival company, and many of their customers and employees followed suit. Dan held on to his bitterness, but eventually had to declare bankruptcy and move out of the area. Susan found herself living in a small flat with the money from the sale of their house, but no other income from Matt. With few qualifications or experience, she was forced to work multiple temporary jobs as a domestic and waitress on 0-hour contracts. Her former friends shunned her, and she was barely speaking to her own mother and sister. Meanwhile, Matt's increased salary and bonuses allowed him to drop down to a 3-day work week and focus on his neglected sports and outdoor interests. He hadn't realized just how much Susan had influenced his decisions, including buying a large house and filling it with unnecessary possessions. But now free from those constraints, he wasted no time in selling the house. He remained in contact with Susan's mother and sister, Diane in particular, who continued to apologize for her sister's betrayal and assure him that she would never make the same mistake. A mischievous thought crossed Matt's mind, wondering what exactly Diane meant by that statement. He couldn't help but imagine exploring that possibility at some point, fully aware that it would drive Susan mad with jealousy. Congratulations if you have made it this far into the story. Please consider giving the video a thumbs up and subscribe to WTF Media for more awesome stories. You can continue your journey with these 2 amazing videos on your screen.